This is Brent. Brent Allen Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com. Coming at you from the remote hinterlands of the Wabash River Valley, where the hogs, the frogs, and the dogs keep up the racket all night long. Let's do one question from the Catechism on the Constitution. I believe it's question 248. Thank you, Miss Francine. Question 248 out of 333 questions, Stansbury's Catechism on the Constitution. By the way, Stansbury, being a clergyman, Arthur J. Stansbury, he also had been catechized. Therefore, he thought the Catechism, as the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, and the Romanists all think that's a good way to learn, and it is. And the Bible talks about catechism and the value of it even in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament as well. And to be catechized is to learn a whole lot of stuff. So it's a very effective way to learn anything. Just to mention, I hadn't mentioned this, Arthur Stansbury was from what we call today the state of New York. And he was a graduate of Columbia College back in the year 1799. He was licensed as a preacher in 1810. That was the same year, as we had said before, that Webster published his 1828, the same year that he published this, 1828 history on the Constitution of the United States Catechism. And amazingly, Arthur J. Stansbury had an interest that is one of my own interests, and that is geology, and he'd written quite a bit about geology too. Well, let's talk about question 248 then. Are there courts in every state of the United States? And the answer is yes. Each state appoints judges of its own state to see that its laws are executed. Remember, every state in America is a sovereign state. Sovereign. That means that each one of the states, for example, being a sovereign, has a law against grand treason against the state. Grand treason, every state. There's not a country or a state, a sovereign jurisdiction in the world that won't execute you for treason. But then, of course, treason needs to be defined properly in order to be used properly. But the courts of every state of the United States are there to see that the laws, now he misquotes here, he misspeaks. He says to see that the laws are executed. Wait a minute. Do the courts have authority, any court have authority in our common law country to execute the laws of our country? Answer, no. I like Arthur J. Stansbury a lot. That's why I'm doing his catechism. He's a right-headed man. Do I find blatant errors in what he says? Of course I do. This is not the Bible. But when he makes them, I'm responsible to say something about it. The courts are not the executive branch of government that execute the laws, as he says here. No, what do? The courts interpret the laws as they are applied in specific instances. In specific instances. We talked about the Supreme Court opinion, D.C. versus Heller. wherein Justice Scalia wrote a majority opinion and affirmed, with great erudition and accuracy, I might add, affirmed that the Second Amendment is a personal right to carry a gun. It's not just something the man can do while he's mustered into the militia. No, he carries it all the time if he wants, and he should. That's his point. You should have one handy. I started to say a while ago, we had 3 guns in the house when I was growing up. Had a 22 caliber rifle, a 38 caliber pistol, and a 12 gauge shotgun. The 22 caliber rifle is what my granddad bought my father when he got a driller's job over in the St. Elmo oil field. That's a Lutheran settlement, by the way, of farmers. Well, Altamont, over in that area. He got a job as a driller with Joe Claypool, and he would make good money. And he bought my father a 22 caliber rifle from Montgomery Ward mail order catalog. And then he had a 38 caliber pistol that he got when he was at Okinawa. People were so sick of war after Okinawa. See, after Okinawa, that was the last battle and the largest battle of the war. And then after that, it was the bombs, 2 bombs. The war was over, and nobody cared about the rules anymore. Dad came home. It was all against the law, probably. He told me it was. He came home with a 38 caliber pistol and a Jap sniper rifle and a whole bunch of Japanese flying outfits that I wore when I was growing up in the snow. They were full length for pilots and fighter airplanes, the Zero. I had a whole bunch of them. They found a cache of them, and Dad took some of them and put them in his bag and brought them home. And they were waterproof. And of course, when I was growing up, the Japanese were not huge people. So when I was growing up, I was anywhere from 7, 8, 10, 12. I wore those. I wore those out in the snow if it got cold. That's something. So he had that 38, the 22 caliber, and then he had the 12 gauge shotgun. It was a 1912 Stevens model pump shotgun. Now, where were they kept? This is an American custom. We don't even stop to consider. You say, oh, above the fireplace. Well, that's one place. Easy to grab it there. That's true. But he kept it. We didn't have a fireplace. It was just an old 2-story. At that time, it was old. It was my grandmother's father built a 2-story farmhouse. It was a frame house heated by a wood burning stove. So he kept didn't have a fireplace, so he kept the shotgun rifle behind the door. He opened the door on the side of the house, go out on the side porch, and it was right there. Right there. And that way it was handy. When you ran out the door, there it was. Just like the Minutemen. We didn't think of it that way, but that's truly what it amounted to. It was there to grab and always loaded. And we knew, my brothers and I knew, we were not to touch it. And we never did. And Dad very seldom picked it up either. But when he did, we knew he was doing some serious business. He was either killing a varmint trying to get the livestock, or he was trying to clear people out of the creek bottom that were trying to shoot at us. And that happened once. Oh, yeah. Here's how it happened. I learned a valuable lesson through this experience. I'd probably see Cousin Harold was about 20. That would have, well, no, Cousin Harold was about 25, because I'd have made me about 14 or 15, which I was. Let's see. Well, I know the year now. I'm bringing it around. It would have had to have been about 1968. That would tell me, yeah, I would have been old enough to swing a spade, because we were digging water lines. We'd gotten electricity, and then Dad dug a pond, or had a pond dug across the road. He put electric pump in to pump water into the house, which we didn't have before. And then he got the idea, instead of pumping water for the cattle and the hogs with one of these swinging a hand pump, we'd put that water on that pump and pump it out to the livestock. And we were digging lines. We didn't have those ditch witchers. We'd dig it with a spade. And we were digging a water line out on the sand hill north of the house. Hot day, scalding hot, sweat dripping off of the ends of Dad's ears. Dad's got big ears. My mother had big ears. She still does. So does he. He's still, as you know, 99 years old. Big ears. Didn't stick out much, but they were big. He could hear good. By the way, my father's hearing is just as good now as it's ever been. Mine's not. His is. He's got good hearing. Well, but I'd watch, and my father, when he'd work, he sweat like a mule. The water would pour out of his hide. Now, some people don't do that. They work hard. They'll sweat sometimes, but not much. Dad, boy, the water would pour out of him, and it pours out of me too. So Dad would take his bandana and tie it around his head here so the water wouldn't run down in his eyes and he couldn't see. His eyebrows would catch a lot of it and kind of rake it off like this, but I would watch sweat, and how it'd get down on his ears, I'm not sure. Maybe it came out of his scalp. It'd drip off the ends of his ears. It was about 100 degrees and about 100% humidity. And that was normal that's normal back in the Wabash Valley. We're out there. Oh, I remember all the things that happened. The New Madrid earthquake went off about that time. We'd built a tin building right there, and we didn't know what was going on. And then when the New Madrid quake hit, and I think this is the last time a major quake we had there. It's the biggest fault in the country, by the way. And then when it finally snaps, it's going to do some serious damage. But last time it really snapped was in 1811, 1812, according to the books. Changed the course of the Mississippi River in about 11 places, from what I read. The town of New Madrid, they call it, Missouri, down the boot hill of Missouri, it changed its position. And the town then emptied out, flooded. I think some people rebuilt it. New Madrid had about a few hundred people in it. That was a big town, and that was the wild and woolly edge of the world in those days. Well, people were making money because it was on the river there. Well, the New Madrid quake hit, and we heard that tin building like that. Looked at each other. We thought, what in the Sam Hill is going on? And we didn't find out till later. Went to school, and then we started hearing about it. What had happened? Well, that's another story. I'm off my subject. We were digging that water line, Cousin Harold, Dad, Brother Davy, and me. We all had spades. Now, there's a lost art. We were spading the ditch, and Dad insisted that the ditch look the same all the way, be straight as a string. He'd lay boards down in a straight line. He'd run a line straight as a string, and then he'd lay boards down and say, this is the edge. Keep the spades right on the edge of this line. There's no sense digging more than we have to, and the crookeder we dig, the more work it's going to take. And we dig 2.5 feet deep. If you go up to Montana Dan's area, you'd probably dig 3 or 4 feet deep, put in a water line, because it gets 40 below up there. It freeze. Well, we know how deep we'd have to go just to make sure it never freeze or froze. And that was around 6 foot deep, Dan. Is that right? What's the coldest it's ever been there, Dan?
Pretty close to probably 40. Right. 30 is not too infrequent below.
All right. Now, the good thing about it, I've experienced it once, got down 20 below. I've been in cold like that, and I thought I was scared to death that I'd freeze to death. Well, I found out, though, Dan, that when it gets that cold, usually the sun is shining, and all the moisture is frozen out of the air, so it ain't that bad. It feels pretty good. You know, moisture gets the cold into your bones. And without that moisture in the air, it becomes tolerable. We were out cutting wood one time. One time in my life, I remember it got 20 below, and we didn't have any wood, and we needed to go out and cut wood, and I didn't want to leave the house, but we had to. And I had never experienced anything that cold and didn't know what it would do to me, and I put on two pair of socks and had my gum boots, G-U-M, not G-U-N, for gumbo. That's what we call it at home, gum boots. And 2 pair of coveralls and a coat and a heavy sock hat and 2 pair of gloves. And I got out there, and within 15 minutes, I was sweating like a stuck hog. I started shedding my clothes. It was 20 below, and it was just wasn't that bad. Is that the experience you've had when it gets cold, Dan?
Yeah, if you do a little work, it warms you up.
Yeah.
And the sun's really warm.
Yeah, and usually the sun's out. You know, we used to say, Dan, that when you cut wood in the winter, you get warm twice. You get warm while you're cutting the wood, and you get warm then after you get it to the house and get it in the stove. But I remember my job at that time, we'd felled a big red oak tree in the fence row. It was old, and we, of course, let it lay there 3 or 4 years to dry out before we cut it up. We were felling trees ahead a few years so they'd have time to dry out, and it came time to cut that one up. Work it up, as we say. We'd say work it up. And my job in working it up was take an axe, and usually a 2-bitted axe, and just go along the limbs and pop the twigs and the branches off that needed to be popped off that you could pop off with an axe. Well, it was about 20 below, and I found out, shucks, I just happened to hit one of those limbs, and it just broke off. And then I realized I didn't even need to use the axe on some of it. I could just go along with my hand if I had a heavy glove on, just pop those twigs and limbs off of there, which I did, and that's what the cold did for me. You know, when you're popping limbs off, like, you always cut in the direction that it grows. You don't cut against it. If you do, you won't get anywhere. Little things like that. I can handle an axe some, but not like some of these fellows. I've watched men that could do almost magical things with an axe, and with great speed and accuracy, I might add. All sorts of things. Well, getting back to the point, what was my point? We were talking about getting cold and how cold it gets and digging water line. Yeah, you're 6 foot. We didn't get it. It didn't get that cold. So, shucks, I lived in Arizona, Dan, and water lines in the little town where I lived they didn't even run them underground. They'd run them in the house. They'd run them up in the attic. But they didn't have to worry. They didn't think. But every 100 years, you get one of those sub-zero spats that come through, and that happened when I was in this little town. A town of about 1,000 people, and the houses, every house in the town, in the outlying areas, the water pipes burst and flooded the homes, including mine. It got down to 6 above. Well, that never happened there. The insurance companies were overwhelmed. They couldn't pay for it all. The lines in the insurance offices were long. Fortunately, I was renting the place I was in, so I wasn't really responsible, but fortunately, Dan, the computers, we had this ancient kind of a computer, and I had it up on boxes, and so when the place flooded, it didn't ruin that. That was just by happenstance. At any rate, we're out there digging this water line, sweat's pouring off of Dad, and Davy and I are just like him. The sweat pours off of us. By the way, that's good for you. It gets the poison, or as they say in the Wabash Valley, the poison, out of your body. They say, I believe it. And all of a sudden, Cousin Harold said he just kept working. He never stopped swinging his spade, but he said, somebody's shooting at us. And as long as Dad was swinging his spade, we were supposed to be swinging ours, see? Pumping it up and down. And I didn't stop either, but I said, well, how do you know? He said, I can hear the rounds swishing through the timothy grass around us. Of course, I'm thinking, I better get horizontal here if somebody's shooting at us. Well, it was squirrel season, see? Dog days of summer. That means that the leaves were still green, but it was before they started turning color, and it was still hotter than a pistol and humid. And then Cousin Harold said, well, I heard another one. Well, Dad must have heard it too. I didn't at that time, but Dad jammed his spade into the ground, and Dave and me and Harold and I, we got horizontal on the protective side of that pile of dirt we were throwing up out of that ditch, because we didn't want to get hit, And Dad took off for the house, and it was probably, 100, and we could see him. We were on the hill. We could see him go down in the draw and up to the house. We could see him, and we just laid there and watched, and he was hot-footing it. He didn't run, but Dad could walk fast, and we knew where he was going because he got this certain way of walking when he was going to get his shotgun. And when we were littler, we used to always follow him because we wanted to see what he was going to shoot. Well, he went to the house, and then here he come hot-footing it back, and we saw him go out and into the woods. So we lived right on the edge of the creek bottom, and so the hogback hills went out into the bottom, like some of them like fishing poles stuck out over the creek bottom. And they come to a point out in the woods. Well, he went down on that one, we called it the center hogback. We called it Center Hill. He went out on that, on the tip of it, and we could see him down there through the trees. And he started on his left, and he had that shotgun full, and he just started boom, and then he'd move about 15 degrees and boom, and he just covered the whole creek bottom. And then he started where he left off on the right, and he came back the other way. Now, he didn't know where this shooter was, but this shooter thought he was having fun, apparently, trying to scare us. And we knew that people did that. See, when they had squirrel season, the boys from St. Louis would come, and they'd want to go squirrel hunting. Well, sometimes they'd ask, and sometimes they wouldn't. But they were scary. They didn't know what they were doing. You talk about guns being dangerous. One time we were shucking corn and out in the field, and these boys from St. Louis came over. They were of the opposite skin tone, and they had their shotguns, and they were friendly, and they wanted to go rabbit hunting. It was rabbit season. We knew there were rabbits as thick as flies around there, and Dad said, okay, boys, you can go rabbit hunting, but don't shoot toward the buildings, and don't shoot toward us. And so they lined up across the field, a bunch of them, all had 12-gauge shotguns, so they couldn't miss. And they just start, that's the way you rabbit hunt around home. You start walking, and then when you scare up a rabbit, you'd take turns. This guy over here would get the first shot, and usually, if you know what you're doing, you won't miss. And then you just take turns who gets to shoot. We thought. Or we were watching, and they scared up a rabbit, and the rabbit took off running, and they all opened up on him, about a dozen of them. And none of them hit him, because he was dodging, they're not stupid. Boom, boom, boom. And then the rabbit, he thought, well, you think they're not smart. I don't know. But he thought, well, if they're that stupid, I'll just come and I'll come back and I'll run right through them. And if they won't stop shooting, they'll just shoot each other. And that's exactly what happened. The rabbit went forward, and then it came back through that line of men with those shotguns, and they were just blasting away. And that rabbit ran right through, and they just kept blasting away from both directions, trying to catch a rabbit in the crossfire while they were catching each other in the crossfire. Now, fortunately for us and them, somehow, by a miraculous act of God, they didn't hit each other. But Dad said, we can't have this. I'm going to go tell those boys I've decided that they need to go somewhere else, and he did. They went somewhere else. Well, Dad came back after being out and covering the creek bottom. He came back, and he hot-footed it back to the house. And, of course, he put his shotgun behind the door, probably reloaded it so it'd be ready again behind the door. And then he came hot-footing it back, grabbed his spade. We were in the prone position on the safe side of the dirt pile along the ditch. He picked up his spade and started pumping it up and down and digging. Well, that was our signal, and we knew he didn't have to say anything. We grabbed our spades and got back in it. And Dad never stopped, sweat pouring off of him, spade a pumping, and we heard him say, what do you suppose was the meaning of that little exercise? I said, well, as I'm pumping my spade, I said, well, you didn't want anybody shooting at us. And he just kept pumping his spade, and he said, well, no, I don't want anybody shooting at us, but that's not the important point. And I said, or Dave, I don't remember, said, well, what's the important point? He said, no man should ever Listen to this. I remember. I got it. No man should ever let anybody, for any reason or cause or in any way, drive him from the work that God has given him to do. Now, you think I didn't forget that? I didn't forget that. Now, without thinking, and not until I got older, did I begin to think about it, though. I knew it, and I kind of stayed with things. That means you don't quit. If you believe God has given you something to do, it better be a conviction. I hope it is, not a preference, not something you'll quit, but something you'll see all the way through to the end. Oh, if it's something God has given you to do, if it's something that relates to the support of his trust settlement, yes. This is something that Martin Luther had. He had the sense of dominion. John Wycliffe had, before him, had in Britain, had a sense of dominion. Melanchthon didn't have that sense, and he lost it, and the Lutherans lost it with him. And that makes things anemic. It makes them very ingrown. No, Christianity, the race of Japheth, is wide open. He wants to take, he stresses, the others do too, don't get me wrong. John Jasper wanted the Bible to make sense too, but he was better at communicating it than the white boys. See? We all bring different contributions. I wish, I want to wire the Bible, but I wish I could communicate the way John Jasper could, the way E.V. Hill could. I used to go listen to E.V. Hill when I was in Los Angeles, and sometimes, or in the Los Angeles area, sometimes E.V. Hill from South Central would come and speak to us in chapel. And I used to say, I wish I could communicate like that. I can't. Probably can't. It's my culture has not enabled me that way. That's all right. I've got other things, other work God has given me to do. And God has given you work to do too. But if you don't have a sense of dominion, that God's given you this duty that arises out of law, out of his law. All of the law of God, all of the Bible is an expression of his will. The will of the sovereign is law. And out of law arises duty, and every duty in that law is in support and furtherance of God's trust settlement of the land the Lord our God has given us. That's what has been lost, not just with the Lutherans. That has been lost with all of Christendom, as in D-U-M-B, not D-O-M. Christendom, D-O-M, means in Anglo-Saxon, Christum, that's a Greek word from the New Testament. It means the anointed one, Christ. But dom is an Anglo-Saxon Germanic word that means irreversible doom. It's the word doom. We say doom, irreversible doom, a final judgment from whose decision there is no appeal. And the judgments of Christ, whether for good or evil, are irreversible. All judgment, says the Bible, in the skies and on the land, in heaven and on earth, has been given to who? Him. In the final day, right now, he has delegated it to us in what we call today the day of man's judgment. That's today, the jury, in our common law tradition. And the day of God's judgment, when Christ comes, that's God's judgment, and he is the one that delivers that judgment, Jesus the Christ. That's called the day of Yahuwah, the day of Jehovah. The prophets talk about it without end. That day. Christendom, D-O-M, or Christendom. I would suggest to you, and I want to do it too, and I'm trying, I want to get on that road to Christendom, the judgments that are true and right and that are coming without fail, to be just, to learn them, to acclimate my mind to them, and not be going away from that. And the whole idea is to take dominion over the land that the Lord your God has given you. You want purpose in life, ultimate purpose, ultimate conviction, and you don't have that in your view or what you're taught or what you understand about Christianity. You may have fire insurance from hell, and you may not be going to hell. I hope you aren't. But you're not having the life more abundant, the purpose. What was the meaning of that little exercise with that 12-gauge shotgun? Hey, you're not a cat, and you're not a dog, and you're not a horse, and you're not a pig, and you're not a cow, and you're not a mule, you're not a chicken. What does that mean? That means you and me, we're not those things, so we can learn from the experiences of others. Little critters can only learn from their own experiences and their own pain and their own enjoyment, and they want to keep doing what's enjoyable and stop doing what's painful. But us, that experience that I had back there with my father, cousin Harold, Davy, I don't want you to ever forget it. You can learn from my experience, and we can have this commonness, and I can learn from yours. That's why I read the chat. And I just want you to relax and not worry about me reading it. Just say whatever you want to say if you think it's important. Be respectful and never be obscene. I asked Miss Francine the other day, I said, well, I don't think we've had any problem with obscenity in the chats. People are polite. She said, yes. Now, sometimes they'll get pretty rough with one another and use words that are a little bit questionable. And I know I'm pretty rough too. I grew up in a rough environment that was raw. It's not like it's always wrong, but because of the sensibilities of others, I would ask you, even when you're talking to each other in the chat, keep in mind, there are girls there, men, women. Let's draw the distinction and be polite to them. Their ears and their minds will not take the roughness that yours will. There are cultural lines that God has given us. Let's observe them. Let's go out of our way to show deference and respect to the female of the species. It'll make us feel better. God demands it. And they'll feel better too. And we're responsible for their welfare, my friends. We're responsible. Just as they are responsible in many ways for ours, but we are responsible in different ways for theirs. Why am I saying this? Because I want to remind myself too. I'm rough as a cob. I spent many years, over a dozen years as a sailor. That gave me a mindset and habits that are rough. And then, of course, I was on the farm where we'd shoot animals and go hunting. And we lived a pretty aggressive, rough life in some ways, trying to keep dominion over the land. And some of those things I was talking about, not to be talked about in polite company. I've had to learn this through the years. When I was in politics, I sat down at a church house, a Church of Christ. They were having a big get together and they wanted me to come and speak. And they were having, like people do round home, they're having a big feed down in the basement of the church. A big feed, a place called Sullivan. We had Sullivans all over that part of the country, on both sides of the river. I was at this little church, little town named Sullivan. And a fellow sitting beside me, we got to talking. We discovered we had a lot in common. He's off farm, I was off farm. We got to talk about clamping cattle and castrating hogs. I've castrated more hogs than I could count. Not hundreds, friends. Thousands, not thousands. Tens of thousands. I'm good at it. I'm not bragging. It ain't bragging if it's a fact, is it? I'm just good at it. I can do it fast. I can do it efficiently. And you give me a sharp enough pocket knife, and boy, I can go like gangbusters and get the job done. And it had to be done. We did it nonstop. Hogs have a gestation period of 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. That means they can farrow up to 3 times a year. And that means you've got this constant string of hogs going, and this castration business never stopped. That's all I do. Well, I did other things too, but that was one of the jobs that we never stopped doing. By the hundreds and thousands every week and year and day. Well, we were sitting there talking about it, the best techniques and how you can do it fast and describing it. And there was a young lady sitting across the other side, and she stopped us. She said, "Don't you know that we're eating?" Well, to us, it's just part of the world. It never bothered us. But the female of the species was on the other side of the table. I think it was his wife, if I'm not. He was a young fella. If I'm not, I was pretty young then too, frankly. Of course, she probably knew how to prepare them to eat, mountain oysters, people call them. But she thought it was the wrong thing to do sitting at the table. I have a friend, very close friend, who grew up in England. Her mother grew up in England. So she grew up there part of the time too. Her father was an American from Virginia, from the hills of Virginia. No, the Tidewater area. Well, the Piedmont. But she grew up in England. Her father was American. His sensibilities weren't quite as soft and polite as the English. Well, she picked up her mother's sensibilities, and like I say, we're close friends, just as close as anybody, sitting at the table. If I do something that she thinks out of line, she just flat tells me. That's improper, Brent. When I eat with her, I say, of course, my mother taught me this too. I got this down. When the meal's over, and I want to leave or do something, I say, "May I be excused?" And I ask her. It's her table. I ask her. All those things are good. This is Brent. Brent Allen Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com. Coming at you from the remote hinterlands of the Wabash River Valley, where the hogs, the frogs, and the dogs keep up the racket all night long.